I'm Vamsi, one of the co-founders of Contour, and we are building autonomous agents to replace QA engineers. Before we get started with the product itself, I guess a very quick intro. My co-founder couldn't be here today, but his name is Arvind. We went to college together. We've been doing this for a while, and we've written a lot of tests in our lifetime and industry experience and startup experience, and we hated every moment of it. So we're trying our best to solve that problem. So for the rest of you who are not as familiar with QA, just a very quick kind of overview of the product, space, and the problem itself. Current testing is super expensive and extremely inefficient. So it's very engineering intensive, time intensive, and it just requires a lot of upkeep. We estimated based on our customer research, user research, and a few other factors that engineers spend about 20% of their time in the total project lifecycle writing tests that ultimately end up being useless because they break the next time the product changes. And a lot of the currently existing tools that try to tackle this problem are super developer focused. So they try to make it faster to write tests or easier to write tests, or will suggest auto completions on lines of test code, or you can browse around in an iframe and click on things and point to stuff and record a user flow, and they'll try to convert that into code. And all of these they're not great. They end up creating tests that kind of look like this, super ugly, barely readable, honestly, and extremely easy to break. So you can see an example here where they're trying to get input fields based on kind of the placeholder text, and the next time that changes, this task becomes useless, and someone has to go and fix it or change it. And so that's where Contour comes in, and our biggest claim in the space is that quality should not be an engineering level problem. It should be a product level problem. Product managers, heads of products, VPs of engineering have so much context about where the product is going and what the product will look like, and they should be able to have full control over the quality testing and quality assurance of that product. So I guess in a way it's kind of awkward because I'm at a AI for developers talk, and this is not a dev tool at all. It's meant for PMs, products people, and heads of product, but at the end of the day, I think we can still take a lot away from it as developers. So again, briefly to reiterate, engineers hate writing tests. There's two ways tests are usually written. PMs write out product specs or engineering specs. They go to the engineers and iterate, and then the engineers go to the QA people and they iterate within themselves to kind of update these tests. And sometimes at smaller or even larger companies, the PMs just directly interface with the QA team. Again, both of these suck. Engineers just want to build new features, build cool products. They don't want to write tests. And PMs hate having to wait for the QA team to get back to them about being able to reproduce bugs or implement new user stories. And so that's where our platform comes in. A very quick demo might do the trick. So as context for this demo, we're using Etsy because it's a very public and well-known kind of website. So assume you're a PM at Etsy and you want to test maybe the login flow of your website. So you can come into Contour's dashboard and say, hey, we changed something with authentication. Maybe we introduced single sign-on, or we introduced Google Auth. Can you make sure that login still works with this username and, of course, pre-described password? Here's a starting URL. And they can click generate test. And for transparency, this is not what the actual display would look like. This is purely for demo purposes. All of this would happen in the background, but just so you guys can see what's actually happening. It'll generate individual steps, write the associated code with each of those steps. And once it's done, you can click run tests and actually watch the test live. Just to reconfirm, yeah, this is exactly what I described. Cool, everything checks out. And you can watch it run. It'll, of course, confirm that, yeah, I was able to log in. and that was a valid login test. And we kind of run into a bunch of examples like this. I can go through a few more test cases because, logging in is it's a very simple test case. What about something more complicated than that? Maybe you're a PM at Airbnb and you've changed your pricing model and you want to make sure that, adding gas affects pricing exactly how you thought it should. So again, you can come in and say, hey, add a few guests to like a random property and make sure the price changes accordingly. And again, it's a very simple sentence. They type in basically 7-8 words and it's able to infer what the intent of the test is. So again, as you see, it's generating the steps, going and generating the associated code. This is kind of where some of the intelligence comes in as well. Our model is able to interpret the intent of the test. So what the user really wants to test here is how the pricing changes. It doesn't really matter what they test on. So in this example, for some reason, it decided to go to the camping subsection and pick a random property there. But at the end of the day, which property it picks is mostly irrelevant because what's being tested is not on that page. And again, once it's done writing the code, you can always run the test, watch the test live, make sure it's doing exactly what you thought it would. Sorry about the quality there. But yeah, it goes to the guest dropdown, adds some new gas and checks the new price and makes sure that it's changed accordingly. And we can kind of walk through more examples of these, but I think that kind of conveys the general idea of what we want the product to look like in its initial phase. Someone can type in a 5-6 word description of what they want tested. It will generate all the code. You can run it live. You can watch it. You can see screenshots. You can debug on the fly and go from there. Some classic examples were put in here that I'm going to briefly skip through, but we can always come back to them. Now I want to switch over to the actual product itself. So this is kind of what the general UI will look like. So this is an example customer that was okay with us showing their product. So they have a bunch of tests here that either they've created or one of their engineers has created or one of the PMs has created. And they run on some schedule. Some people want it to run daily or on some hourly cadence. Some people hook it up to CI/CD and want it to run on every Git push or Git deploy, whatever the customer wants. And obviously for any of these runs, you can always click into them, see which runs passed, which runs failed. And for any individual run in a testing suite, you can always click view details, watch the actual video of the run if you want to see exactly what it was doing or exactly where it failed maybe. So I'm just kind of forwarding through this video. And as the model generates individual steps for what should be in the test, it takes screenshots. So if you don't have time to watch like a minute-long video, you can just scroll through the screenshots and be like, okay, cool, it found the page, it found this tab, it did what it was supposed to do, and etc. And so going back to this main page really quickly, right now it's set up to run kind of testing suites. Different customers want different things from this. Sometimes they want QA engineers to be able to hop on and just run individual tests. You can always do that. And you can hop into one of these and run one of these individually. Most people just like having the entire test suite run basically every time there's a new change. So anytime there's a new Git push or Git commit. You see some of these tests are actually in different states. Most of these say ready because they're ready to run. One of these says processing. This is because this test was either recently modified or recently added, and the actual test script is being generated. Right now, you can see in the top left corner, it says beta. We've temporarily halted the live generation because we're working with an enterprise customer. And just to be safe, we have a human in the loop at the last verification step. So you won't actually be able to see this run live. But in general, all of these tests, as soon as they're created, you can just run immediately in the moment. And so this is the current phase of the product. And this is not where we see the long-term vision actually being. The more we talk to customers and the more we kind of build out this product, the real key value add here is being able to give all of this control to PMs, heads of products, and people on the product level. And so that means being able to embed ourselves earlier in the process. For example, when a PM first designs a product spec, or maybe designs an engineering spec with his engineering team, currently they have to wait until actual lines of code are written to start thinking about testing. Now we have the ability to ingest those kind of like PRDs or product specs or engineering specs and say, hey, it looks like you're designing a marketplace. Let's suggest some order flow tests or checkout tests or authentication tests, or maybe you have an inventory API. Maybe we should test around that because this product will probably end up using that. And so we'll auto suggest these tests, but because nothing has been developed yet, the tests aren't generated. And so every time there's a new Git push, every time there's a new commit, and as more of this product is being built out, we can live generate these tests and say, hey, it looks like you just built out the single sign-on, or you just built out the cards and the checkout flow. We have that as one of the suggested test suites. Now that we have the actual code to work with, we'll generate the tests. And so as the product grows, we grow the testing suite with it. And one of the key features here is being able to auto-heal these tests. So one of the examples I used before, Etsy signing in, we saw that on their page, sign-in said sign-in. But if we go back maybe to one of these, this earlier example with Cypress. So currently when you have something like this, if you were to ever change for some reason, taking email addresses to now taking usernames or usernames and email addresses, this entire test fails and someone has to go and fix that. But now, because we're hooked into your CI/CD, we see that in your code, hey, what used to be email addresses now says username/email address, or just username, or something else entirely. And we can regenerate that test and no one else has to come in and actually fix it manually. And then the final stage of this is once the product is actually released, we introduce this concept called user personas. And that's where kind of our core tenet of testing comes in and why we're so insistent that testing should not be an engineering problem. The best way to test a product is to have thousands of people using it. It's not telling a QA engineer to think of test scenarios or for the PMs to try to come up with user stories. Is to have real people use the product. And that's where the concept of user personas comes in. We'll integrate with LogRocket, Amplitude, Mixpanel, whatever your user logging suite happens to be, and say, hey, look, it seems like users are using your product this way. Maybe let's write tests that mimic those users. So one of our favorite examples to use is we work with a kind of pharma distributor, and they have a marketplace where a Walgreens owner or CVS owner can come on and say, hey, I want to restock on Tylenol, right? But these are 45, 50-year-old people who aren't always technologically adept. And they'll come to the Tylenol page, someone walks in the store, they forget about it. And by the time they come back, the product logs them off. And then they never think about Tylenol again until the next time. And in that moment, it's lost interaction, it's lost revenue, it's lost traction. But we can mimic that. And we can create a test that says, hey, it seems like users sometimes just leave your product for hours on end because the people using it are store owners or store managers. So we can write a test that says, log in, add an item to the cart, and wait 3 hours. Come back. Once they've logged out, mimic them logging back in and trying to find that product again. Maybe that informs your engineering decisions. Maybe now you default to showing their last visited page when they log in. And all of these things can be suggested, generated automatically. And the biggest thing that comes with this is being able to capture that real user interaction. Again, no sane QA engineer is ever going to write a test that says, add an item to cart and wait 3 hours. It's just not something anyone is ever going to think of on their own unless they physically see it happen. So why wait for the engineer to see it happen when we can do it automatically? And again, that's our fundamental premise and why we built the product. We think no software engineer should ever be subjugated to writing test code manually. Probably one of our biggest technological hurdles that we've had to overcome and are still overcoming, honestly, just depending on the complexity of the product. What we've realized is this is where the product becomes more than just a GPT wrapper. Because you're right, GPT alone sometimes struggles with these assertion statements or being able to logic or do business logic beyond code generation. And so I would say we have a split of around 40-60, 60% GPT, 40% heuristics. And a lot of these assertions are kind of defaulted to the heuristic portion of our product. For a little bit of context, I was a principal engineer at a different startup before this, and I did basically their entire testing suite using browser automation. So I just have a lot of context coming in, and we're able to use a lot of those as heuristic functions to determine kind of what to look for, how to do that business logic, and aid and help GPT determine those end conditions. Right now, we're mostly focused on UI testing. I don't think that limits us in any way from doing additional testing. So a lot of the testings that we've kind of explored are more like load testing, like kind of variants that we can build on pretty naturally with what we have. I think we're refraining a little bit from doing more back-end testing or API testing because there's a ton of products that kind of target that space. And honestly speaking, those kind of features and engineering involved with that isn't as flaky as UI. UI tends to be one of the most flakiest parts of your product, and it's usually the part that requires the most iteration of testing. So that's why we focus on UI, but we're open to doing. A lot of the training happens on the physical kind of HTML DOM of the product. It requires a lot of pre-processing, a lot of finagling, but we've developed a system to kind of identify the key features of the DOM that actually matter when you're doing testing. DOMs tend to be very heavy for absolutely no reason, just because people use like no-code tools to build up websites, or like they use like open source libraries, and there's just a lot of like extra content there that doesn't really contribute to the actual functionality of the UI. So we're able to remove a lot of those. And once we have like a more succinct version of your product in terms of HTML, CSS, JavaScript content, we can train on that. And it's a lot easier to train on that. Obviously, initially, it's going to be, for any new product, the first few test cases will be a little bit wacky, and that's just expected. But as we get more commits, more pushes, more CI/CD integration with you, and as we generate more tests for you, it learns more and more about the product, and it's able to do it way better. To quickly clarify, when I say code, I mean the HTML code of the product. We obviously can't look at the product code for obvious security reasons. But yes, it operates on the HTML code itself. It doesn't need to be trained every time, actually, on a new product. It's kind of like an ongoing one-shot process. And as we get more products, we just add more data to the model. But it's just one kind of training session. We don't like individually train on each product. That would be kind of too much. That's why we kind of have it separated into two phases. Until we're able to fully automate the generation of the test, we want to give the users the ability to modify certain steps or edit certain parts of the test. As you can imagine, especially on like marketplace customers, sometimes we'll generate a test that goes to like checkout or tries to order a certain item from a certain like part of the product. And there's like 10 different ways of getting there, right? And the test, when it generates, we'll choose one of those 10 ways. But maybe the person who is writing the test wants to test one of the other 9 ways. So we give them the ability to edit both individual steps and also just specify in the initial prompt, I specifically want this user flow, right? And it's able to understand the intent behind that. And once they do edit, the entire test gets regenerated, because sometimes there's cascading effects. So we just want to make sure that we capture all of that, and the whole test gets regenerated, and the process continues. We have been doing this. We've been live as a product for actual real customers for about 6 weeks. Obviously, building it took a little bit longer than that. But we have around 6 design partners who kind of bought in early into this vision. They actually started paying us before we even wrote a single line of code. They hated testing. They hated the thought of hiring QA engineers, and they were like, hey, if you can do it for us, we'll pay you happily. And so that was nice. They've been great for getting feedback from. They've helped us a lot in terms of iterating the actual product. And then beyond those design partners, we recently ventured into enterprise customers. So I was mentioning one, which is a pharma distributor. We have 2 more in the works as well. Those are more recent developments, about 2 weeks old, I would say. And that's kind of the avenue we really want to focus on, is kind of mid-market to enterprise scale customers. Mid-market because that's usually when, like post-Series A-ish, is when you start thinking about hiring QA teams or hiring QA engineers, like specifically to do QA. Like obviously before you'll have engineers do QA by themselves, but to specifically hire a QA team. And instead of hiring a QA engineer or QA team, you can just hire us and we'll scale with you, we'll grow with you. And especially as we grow with you and learn more about the product, we're able to generate way better tests for you. So that's where we kind of see the long-term play, is kind of growing with these Series A, Series B companies. Enterprise will always be there, but I think our target will be that kind of mid-market area. Actually, very early on, our first iteration of the product, I'm not sure if anyone knows what this product is, but there's a competitive product called Reflect. It's just one of the many like currently existing QA tools. And they have this like recording concept where there's an iframe. You can pull up your product and like kind of like click around the test case and it'll like write code for you and like it'll generate the test. And we realized as we tried to make this developer oriented, we just kind of ended up building something very similar to them. And I'm sure they're at their core a good product, but they certainly have not had like too much traction. And there's something fundamentally missing with that kind of approach. And we couldn't quite figure out what it was until we talked to more customers. And we realized making it easier to write tests is a fine goal to have as a product. But the issue is not writing tests faster. It's the fact that no one actually wants to write the test. And so we needed to focus on people who have enough knowledge about the product to help us generate these tests, but don't have to be able to like physically code. And we realized the layer of the company that makes the most sense to target at that point would be a layer above engineers. So heads of products, VPs of engineering, whatever the role happens to be at a specific company. And so we shifted our entire framework to kind of target and orient towards them. We're obviously still working on a lot of the accessibility features. I will say, I think most of our current competitors don't have, most of our current customers don't have too many features that unfortunately deal with that. So we haven't had to come to that technological hurdle at this point. Our most recent customer, actually one of the tests I think I briefly showed on screen, I can pull it up. One of the Google auth flows that we're working on is people who want to have kind of like magic links or like other ways of accessing the product that's not just typing in a username or password or like using Google Auth. So we're trying to build out that portion of the product. And obviously as we get more exposure to products with accessibility features, we're going to start implementing those as well. But I just can't give you a great answer right now because we just haven't encountered it at this point. So one of these tests that fails, where the test fails, because we have every step and every screenshot along the way, we basically know at what point in the code the test has failed. And we're able to, depending on what kind of integration you want, we can either generate like a Jira ticket, a GitHub issue, whatever your integration happens to be, and point to a specific portion of the code and say, hey, between deployments 9 and 10, this test failed. Here's the code that changed. Here's where it failed. Here's a video of it failing. Here's screenshots of exactly what it looked like at failure. And that's usually more than enough information for an engineer to get all that pretty quickly. That's a funny question because we actually started as a demo product before pivoting to this about 2 months ago. It definitely has the same core technology. I think it's a slightly different use case for obvious reasons. We probably will end up focusing more on the testing use case than the training or demo or sales use case, because we learned this the hard way from doing user research. But when it comes to sales and when it comes to training, people want consistency in narrative, and that's not always guaranteed with this kind of like generative approach. Sometimes you'll create slightly different demos just based on an input prompt or some sort of different starting condition, or you'll create a slightly different like training module depending on where you start. And people don't always love that. They want kind of consistency across the board when it comes to how they sell or how they onboard people onto their product. So though it is the same core technology, I think we'll probably refrain from going into that space.